We're now going to look at a huge structural change. A lot of people have talked about it. It's the internet. But what makes the internet so special? Well, it has three major characteristics. The first one, it's global. In other words, it's everywhere. Okay, so you have a global look at everything. It's not limited by sovereign fences. Okay, the second part of it is it's basically intangible. It deals with basically information, communications, and relationships. And third, it is done by forming networks. Now, the first one, knowing the global reach, okay, and understanding basically its intangible nature are really fine. In fact, it allows you for the first time now as a tiny human being to bypass the sovereign fences. So I can be talking to somebody in Australia, Russia, anywhere, China, it doesn't matter. And permission is not needed by, and nor can it be stopped by the sovereign countries. They just can't stop it. But networks is not understood so well. In other words, if you look at the tape I showed you with Julia and Juliet, it's in one of my other ones, you'll see it. But basically, you can see the difference when Julia Child basically wanted to be approved by the establishment, and Juliet didn't care. She just was doing it because it was intrinsically motivated. She had an interest in it. She was working by day a government worker, and yet was able to bypass all the authority. She didn't get permission. She didn't have to have permission. In fact, one of the key things that's happening here now with the internet, it allows you to bypass limitations that often are part of the government or sovereign fences. You don't have to you don't need this. You can bypass it by using the internet. But in order to use this bypass properly, you've got to understand networks. Networks are so important that we're going to do multiple multiple approaches to this, and I'm going to give you multiple blogs on this. And so this is the first of many blogs on networks, because it's the critical piece that if you're going to bypass, if you're going to have the freedom that's available to you, and to study on the internet, use the information, and communicate your perspective on the internet, and bypass anybody giving any authority to stop you, you've got to understand networks. Network science is not about the computers. And granted, computers have sped up our life. They work terrifically for us, and they've made life easier. But networks are not about computers themselves. It's just like the fax machine. One fax machine alone, although they're no longer being in use, but one fax machine alone didn't do much. When you got two, it was better. When you got three, four, five, pretty soon just about everybody had a fax machine. Now, with the structural change of the internet, nobody uses fax machines. But at the time, the more fax machines that were around, the more valuable each individual fax machine was. So now if you look at what's going on now, the more networks that you're part of, the more you understand network science, the better you're going to be able to succeed, the quicker, etc. Everything now depends on your understanding of networks. And so we're going to look at the very, very basics of networks here in this particular blog, but there are many of them, but this is the first one we're going to do. So if you start to look at it, and you're going to see something like this, you got to understand the language. Just like a doctor has a language, lawyers have a language. I'm a lawyer. You probably don't know what resist loquitur is. It doesn't matter. But see, lawyers have their own lingo. Doctors do too. It's partly so that they can understand, make distinctions that you don't need to know, and that's why they have these new sort of arcane words that they use. But a node is the first thing. That is what you've got to understand. Node is basically one thing. You got to understand what it is. It's a node means it's a noun. It's a person, place, or thing. Anything that is a known is also a noun. And so you've got to understand that every possible thing that you look at on Nodeville is going to be a noun. Now you take another one over here. You have a second node, okay, over here, okay, and these are going to get connected, okay, and this is right here between the two, and this is called a link. So nodes are connected by links. And so when you start to see multiple nodes, okay, around, you're going to see it like this and like this and like this and like this. And if they're all connected by links, all of a sudden what you've got here now, and if you go like this, you're going to see that you have what is known as a cluster of linked nodes gives you what you have here, basically. So it's a cluster. Now, clusters have different sizes. Okay, a small cluster like this is basically just I mean, the average, to give you an idea how small. 90% of all the websites on the internet have 10 or fewer connections. So that's a very small network. 10 or less, 90%. And yet many are much, much bigger. And as you start to get bigger, okay, and you start to create many, many more, you all of a sudden are connecting these in many different ways. And all of a sudden you've got something that has transformed itself many different ways. And it is no longer just a cluster. It is now something that's moved even bigger than that, okay? And so once you've got to that level, it is called a hub. Now, a hub is really a large cluster, but it's big enough so that it has much more than 10, maybe 1,000, okay, basically a hub. So what's really interesting about this is that hubs are getting together very differently than traditional ways of thinking. See, because what's going on with a hub is that if you start to look at this is basically, you've probably seen this before. This basically is a bell curve. Now, what about a bell curve that's common is basically that you have 50% on one side of the curve and 50% on the other side, but also how are they put together? This is done very, very different than traditional way. This is basically done at random. Now, when you get back to the node that we just talked about, and these all got together, this is not that way. That node over there these are attached in a very different way. Basically, people deliberately join these groups. And so it's basically the opposite of random. It's preferential attachment, which means that you choose to be part of a network. You have to join it, you have to participate, it's choice. And it doesn't look like this. A bell curve is done randomly, but preferential attachment is going to show you very differently. It's going to look very, very different. And it's going to look like, basically, it's going to look like this. That's a different curve than this curve. And this curve is called okay, now in a power curve. So a power curve means that up here is the head of your hub, and down here is the tail. So the head of your hub up here, this is where all the big clusters are, and it goes down, it gets smaller and smaller, so you get down to here where you're getting down here with less than 10. And so what's so different about this is that if you can get in terms of understanding whose hub this is and who are the top, roughly, let's just have an example. Let's say that I'm willing to give you, there are about 14,700 airports in America. So I'm going to give you 25% of all these airports in the United States, 14,000 something. You get 20, and I'm going to give you $10 per passenger who gets on there every day. Okay, you get $10 per 25% of 14,700 and something. Okay, $10 per day, or you can have $10 per day with the top 10 airports in America. Well, what you're going to find is it's way better to take the top 10 because these are the ones that have all the traffic, and you'll make much more money if you take the top 10. And why? Because people are preferring to go to those airports as preferential attachment. And so what you've got is airports, they are a noun, and the nouns are, they are nodes. So every node, they follow the same pattern. So if you could know that the top 10 airports are going to give you about 85% of all the business that there is at $10 a head, you want the top 10. If you do it at random, you're not going to get the top 10, probability anyways. And so what you want to understand is you want to look at just the top parts of this curve. In other words, the top 10. If you can own 7 out of those 10, you will own that entire network because all the others are going to follow. So the key thing to understanding here is when you're studying this is that you are looking to create a way to the top 10, not the entire multiple many. As I said, that 90% of all of them on the internet are 10 or less. They're not going to count. The ones you need to get are up here. So the strategy here to understand is preferential attachment, go to the hubs. I learned from Bucky a long time ago that the bigger the picture, the more accurate your prediction. There's nothing in a caterpillar, if you just study a caterpillar, will ever tell you about scenario butterfly. So my entire life, I am working as much as I can to be a comprehensivist. That's interested in everything, so I can make better choices, better decisions, and have a better perspective. What can I do for you?